Welcome and thank you very much for joining us on episode 136 of the Blazers Edge podcast, presented to you today by BlazersEdge.com. I am your weekend co-host, Chris Lucia, and man, it is good to be back. I just took a couple-week break. I'm back for the off-season. Brandon, how's it going, man?
I'm going great. You look tanned and smooth and relaxed. How was that vacation away from the podcast?
Oh, I was definitely listening to it. I wasn't recording or anything, just taking in the playoffs and everything. It was a wild ride because the last podcast I was able to personally record with you was, that was with Evans Clinchey, I think, before the Clippers, or actually it was you and I, immediate post game after game 2 of the Clippers series, when the Blazers were down 0-2, and it was actually kind of a somber podcast. I remember that you and I had. So it's been a wild ride for the Blazers, since I've been on the podcast. But you were able to hold it down with Eric Griffith a couple of times, and Tara and Joe had the weekend podcast last weekend. So things certainly went smoothly when I wasn't around.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting you say the somberness of that last podcast is in contrast. Even though the Blazers season has ended, I think we can both agree an amazing season, and people are feeling more or less good about how everything shook out. But at any rate, if you do want to get in touch with the Blazers Edge podcast, you can always email us at blazersedgepodcast@gmail.com. And both Chris and I would really appreciate if you were to hop on iTunes and Stitcher and YouTube, and please subscribe and give us a rating. That stuff is important. So if you have a moment, please go on there, give us a subscription, give us a rating, good, bad, or indifferent. We'd love to see it.
With us this week on the Blazers Edge Weekend podcast is Blazers Edge staff writer Eric Griffith. Eric, how you enjoying your offseason so far, man?
You know, Chris, I am pretty pumped after this spectacular year for the Blazers to be getting into the offseason and start looking at how the team can improve over the next couple months.
Yes, I know. The Blazers, although they don't have a draft pick as we speak, they may be trying to get in on that action. So we are going to be talking about eventually, the NBA draft in June. We're going to be talking about free agency. That's going to be starting very soon. That when's the moratorium start? Is that July 1st when they can start talking to other teams?
July 1, and the players and owners agreed to shorten it by a couple days after the DeAndre Jordan fiasco, shall we say. So don't quote me on this, but I believe it's July 1 through 6 now.
So there's going to be an opportunity there just under a week for free agents, restricted and unrestricted, to kind of talk to other teams and kind of get deals, kind of get the wheels moving on deals. And there's going to be a lot of time there for us to talk about that. And indeed, Eric actually posted on Friday on Blazers Edge kind of a free agency primer for the Blazers this summer. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't yet. We're going to talk about that during this show at some point. But I think we should probably reflect a little bit on this regular season and postseason that the Blazers just wrapped up, because to me, there was a ton to talk about, and I don't want to necessarily go through it chronologically or throw a million stats at people. I kind of want to actually look at it from the perspective that we kind of had last summer, and now 5-6 months later with everything we know now, hindsight being 2020. I want to see where we were wrong, where things surprised us. And maybe just maybe a few of us got a couple of things right before the season. I'm not sure I did. So I don't know. Where do you guys want to start with this? Because there's definitely a lot to talk about. There are definitely a lot of surprises this season. So Brandon, where do you want to start with kind of taking a look back at the Blazers 2015-2016 season?
I think the obvious starting point would be CJ McCollum's breakout year. Obviously, we saw a little bit of what was to come in that Memphis Grizzlies series last year during the playoffs, where he played exceptionally well. But frankly, I don't know about you two, but the way that I felt about that was that, it was situational, that yes, he's going to be a better player than he showed most of last season during the regular season. But no, I did not think that he would become the player who played so well during that Memphis series. And that's exactly what he became, and even more. I mean, for me, it seemed as though CJ McCollum got better as the year went on, and so to me, that's the obvious starting point.
Yeah, I personally felt like he was gonna have a quote unquote breakout year, I guess, which is kind of the term that we use for the kind of season that he just wrapped up. I don't know if I kind of thought that maybe he would be a bit more inconsistent than he was, and the way that he delivered and the way that he actually, added some dimensions to his game that we didn't even see in that Memphis series. That mid range, that little pull up floater that he has taking guys off the dribble. That was something that he added to his arsenal, or at least bringing up the efficiency doing that to where that's actually a strong point in his game now. And I don't know if that's necessarily something that I saw coming, and particularly like I mentioned that consistency with which he played this season.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. He was very consistent. And one of the reasons why he was so consistent was because as defenses adjusted, CJ added to his game mid-season, which was super impressive because usually what you see is during the offseason, dude adds a crab dribble or a Euro step or whatever. CJ was adding stuff like on practically a weekly basis. I mean, we saw during the playoffs, he added that insane like 9/10 of a travel fake stretch move. I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. And that was to me the most impressive part of his season.
Yeah, CJ absolutely delivered this year. I think, one thing that may be still a question mark for some people would be the legitimacy of that backcourt for the long-term future with CJ McCollum and Damian Lillard in terms of the defensive end of the floor. Were any of those questions answered for either of you guys this season? Watching CJ develop into that starting shooting guard role, playing next to Damian Lillard, we were all worried about how that would play out. Do we know any more, mid-May than we did in late October?
I don't think that we know any more about their defense. And also keep in mind that so much of defense, I mean, there are two big important aspects of defense that can affect how you see individuals, but do not have to do with individuals necessarily. And those two things are A, the familiarity the players have with each other, and B, do you have good defenders behind you? Because you look at the Blazers, and Al-Farouq Aminu, in my opinion, is somewhat of an overrated defender. You had Noah Vonleh playing most of the season at power forward, not a super great defender. Mo Harkless, an eager defender, also not a great defender. And then Mason Plumlee, I would say a poor defender. I don't know if either of you two would argue that, but if you look at the Blazers, again, with those 2 points kind of as your lens, this team only played together for 1 year, and they also didn't have great defenders behind them. So I think that it's possible that we can see a little bit more from this team as they get to know each other next year. And also, if the Blazers were to add, let's say, an elite defending power forward or maybe an elite defending center, I mean, all three of us have talked ad nauseum about an Al Horford or Hassan Whiteside. I think then we might get a better sense of what CJ's and Dame's defense is going to settle into once they have those pieces behind them and once they get to know each other a little bit better.
So with CJ and Dame both being, 4-year guys, I think they're, Dame turns 26 this summer. CJ will be 25 next season, going into his 4th year, Dame going into his 5th. Do we think that, like last offseason, this will be another year where both of them can add to their repertoire? Or do you think CJ and Dame are pretty much, at least offensively, do we think they're kind of at their ceiling?
So CJ still doesn't draw any free throws, really. His free throw rate was one of the lowest ever for a 20-point per game score. And one thing I do want to recognize is that he improved that again. Another thing he improved. He was better at drawing free throws by the end of the season than he was at the beginning. But he could certainly work to get to the foul line more often so that on nights when his jump shot isn't falling, he has a fallback option. He also doesn't do a lot around the rim still. A lot of his drawing of free throws is still in that mid-range via deception. So he could stand to get better around the rim. He actually has that like football-style running back power move Brandon Roy used to have. So I think there's definitely potential for him there to develop that part of his game.
And let me ask both of you, I mean, to my eye, it's not for lack of trying necessarily. I don't think CJ McCollum is necessarily averse to driving. So I wonder, I mean, either maybe am I getting that wrong, or is it just a matter that as you become, a savvier player, a more veteran player, that you're better at, drawing that contact and finishing through it, and also better at kind of framing those fouls and drawing those fouls, and maybe part of it's respect. I mean, what do you think? Is it a matter that he's not driving enough, or is it a matter of when he does drive that he's just not doing a good enough job of doing what he needs to do to get fouls and get those foul calls?
I would say it's the style in which he plays, and I wrote about this earlier in the year, actually, but if you watch CJ, he rarely does the Damian Lillard / Allen Iverson style, like barrel all the way to the rim. He usually stops 5 to 10 feet short and puts another move on. And so he doesn't have that momentum. He also actively avoids contact. And my personal hypothesis is, I'm just guessing here, but I'm thinking it's because he was a short player, shorter than he is now for most of his life. And he was a late bloomer in high school. He was like 5'3" or whatever as a sophomore, I think. And so I think he learned to shoot around guys so well that he never learned to use his athleticism to get to the rim once his body did develop.
So he's got that kind of, that kind of Isaiah Thomas, the current Isaiah Thomas in the NBA kind of mentality where to get your shot off, you have to find space on the court. You have to shake your defender loose. You have to create, more space than a guy who's 6'6" has to create in order to get a clean shot off. So I think that's actually going to work to his benefit if he works on his game. Obviously, he's going to work on it. But if he improves as much as he did last summer, I mean, if he takes that kind of mentality to where he can get a shot off in space or and create the space where he needs to without drawing the contact, and adding being able to drive and absorb a little bit of contact, making it so that he can kind of adjust to the flow of a game, adjust to the officiating of a game, or maybe, in the playoffs, if you have to play a bit more physical, he can kind of adapt a bit more to that style. Maybe adding that to his game. I don't know. I could see that being, adding to his varied skill set on offense.
Yeah, I'd say CJ definitely will almost certainly continue to grow based on what we saw this year. I just wanted to change tracks a little bit here and ask you guys about another Blazers backcourt player. And I'm asking because I honestly don't have too much of an opinion one way or the other. I could see this guy in or out of a Blazer uniform next year. Gerald Henderson. You guys have strong opinions about him after the playoffs?
I don't know if I necessarily have a strong opinion about him, but I like the concept of a Gerald Henderson. But at the same time, I liked the concept of a Jamal Crawford. I liked the concept of a Mo Williams, right? And those folks didn't necessarily end up panning out long-term with the team, obviously, because they're not on the team. But and it frustrated me to no end when Gerald Henderson came back from that hip injury and he was just chucking mid-range shots like he was Kobe Bryant. I mean, in Henderson, if you've seen interviews with Henderson, he alludes to the fact that he very much models his mid-range game after Kobe Bryant, and he also is cognizant enough to admit that no, he is not Kobe Bryant. No, he can't get those shots off every time. But near the end of the season, they started falling, and that is extremely useful off the bench, isn't it? I mean, the question for me is, does Gerald Henderson see himself as a bench player? I believe that he sees himself as a mediocre starter, not as a great bench player, and part of that is going to be up to him as to whether he can buy into that, because I liked what I saw in the second half of the season for sure, but I think part of it's going to be up to him if that's the role that he wants to take or if he'd rather pursue a starting role somewhere else. That's the way I see it. Yeah,
I think, if you look back at Gerald's season, he started out really slow coming back from that hip injury. It wasn't until, was it December or January, till he became, a legitimate, positive in the rotation for Terry Stotts there, and taking a few minutes from Alan Crabb here and there. I mean, I think it was nice to have his intensity. He's certainly kind of sets the tone intensity wise when he's on the court, or at least he seems to be trying as hard as he can, even if not everybody else always is on both ends of the floor. I mean, he's an athletic guy. He's got that kind of ISO game. I think that's a really good. And I've mentioned this a handful of times on the podcast before, that kind of ISO game, that's a great change of pace, for the Blazers. And even if he is no Kobe Bryant, as Brandon Goldner mentioned, he can stick an open mid-range shot. He can hit a contested mid-range shot. I mean, when he's on, and he's really good when, teams are finding ways to stop Stotts' kind of flow offense. You can kind of dump the ball to him and let him, try to find a shot. And it seemed to be like you alluded to, Brennan, toward the second half of the season in the playoffs, seemed to be really effective.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that someone who's not afraid to shoot is super useful off the bench. I mean, ultimately, that's kind of where I was driving my point, which is if you have someone coming off the bench who is not afraid to shoot, the defense knows that, right? If you have someone who's very confident in their shot, even if they don't hit it every time, the defense does know that. It opens it up for everybody else, and it really makes it a lot easier to keep your best players on the bench, maybe a little bit longer if you have someone who's so willing to be in attack mode. And the other thing is too, I mean, I didn't necessarily feel, and I mean, your feelings are no substitute for stats. So maybe the stats wouldn't shake out this feeling that I have. I didn't feel like he was necessarily a black hole. He was willing to pass. I mean, he was willing to kick out. So I don't know. Gerald Henderson, I mean, I'd be stoked to see him in a Blazer uniform again. I don't know what his contract status is. Is he totally unrestricted? What's the deal with him?
So there's a couple things. I just want to real quick touch on your black hole point. He didn't feel like a black hole because there was no one else on the bench to shoot for most of the season. And so it's a lot, and no one else who could create his own shot. So it's a lot easier to say, go ahead and shoot Gerald, when your options are to pass out to Noah Vonleh or Mo Harkless.
I think you're really selling Pat Connaughton short there, Eric. How dare you?
Pat Connaughton had solid garbage time minutes in January. Didn't he have like 3 straight games of 6+ points?
Oh, man. When you crack 6 points, you know you've made it.
So to touch on Gerald Henderson's cap situation, he is going to be an unrestricted free agent. He carries a $9 million cap hold. That means that he will count $9 million against the Blazers' salary cap until the team decides to either renounce or re-sign him. He's a safe bet to get $9 million or more, and so that you can count on that number being the calculation. The problem there is that Allen Crabbe's cap hold is slightly less than $3 million. So if you're choosing, if you assume Crabbe and Henderson carry somewhat similar roles on the team, although I realize they diverge slightly in their offensive ability, and you're having to choose between those two players, Crabbe is the instant choice because he's $6 million cheaper in the short term.
Is there any kind of cap wizardry that you could do in order to keep Henderson kind of under the hat while you shuffle other pieces around? I mean, so for example, I mean, could you have like a gentle person's agreement whereby the Blazers renounce, the cap hold on Henderson, but they kind of say, hey, we're going to renounce you, but just hang out. We'll take care of you. I mean, would that work or would that not work?
Probably not, because there's no reason to renounce a guy until you're going to use that space to sign someone else. And so you wouldn't renounce Gerald Henderson until you had, a guarantee from Dwight Howard or Jan Mahinmi or Kent Bazemore. And I'm just throwing names out.
Jan Mahinmi throwing out the heavy hitters for us on the Blazers Edge Weekend podcast, Eric.
Yeah, I'll go on the record right now. Jan Mahinmi, and I wrote this in a preview in February, so I can stand by it. Jan Mahinmi is my sleeper choice for center for the Blazers next season.
Yes, Neil O'Shea, swing for the fences this summer. Jan Mahinmi is going to be the starting center of the future for the Blazers. But I want to talk about free agency in a minute. Let's get back to looking at the Blazers season here, because another interesting wing player for the Blazers who's going to be a restricted free agent. He's certainly going to get a salary hike this offseason, and that's Alan Cool Breeze Crabbe. Before the season started, I think most people kind of penciled him in as maybe an end of rotation player, kind of maybe a 8, 10, 12 minutes a night kind of guy who takes, maybe 2, 3, 3-pointers or so and helps a little bit on the defensive end, but maybe not, much of an impact player. Now we're talking about him at the end of the season. I think he kind of stepped into, a pretty important role for the Blazers coming off the bench, being a source of offense, for Terry Stotts, particularly, when other guys weren't, was kind of that, catch off the pass, kind of that safety valve option occasionally. Sometimes he was able to get Blazers or keep them in games, when other guys weren't able to. I don't want to oversell it too much, but I think, Crabbe was a pretty important part of that bench rotation. I think he was a competent defender. I think he could probably cut back a little bit on the fouling, and maybe that'll be something that he's able to work on this summer. I know last summer he got hurt in summer league and missed 6 weeks or so of off-season conditioning and stuff. So hopefully this off-season with a full summer to work out healthy, he can kind of work on those deficiencies on the defensive end. But he's certainly going to get a pay raise this summer. What do you guys think if we're talking about Gerald Henderson being unrestricted cap hold of $9 million, Alan Crabb $2.5 million, $2.9 million restriction? He's significantly younger. Alan Crabb or Gerald Henderson? What do you guys think here?
I mean, I'm going to take Alan Crabb, cool breeze, ceiling fan all day, every day. And not just because he's younger, which he is, not just because he has more upside, which he does, but I don't know. For as much as I like Gerald Henderson's aggression and as much as I like Gerald Henderson's fearlessness, Alan Crabb had a lot of those same qualities. And obviously Alan Crabb doesn't have like the kind of the back to the basket kind of game that Gerald Henderson can kind of, back into people and then, get that turnaround jump shot up. Alan Crabb doesn't really have that, but Alan Crabb is excellent from deep. He's an excellent mid-range shooter, that's the one thing that I didn't expect coming into the season. I mean, we all heard the wild one, Mike Rice, was Alan Crabb's biggest fan for a couple, first couple of years he was here. He kept talking about how good Alan Crabb was in practice, and we saw a lot of that stuff on the court this year. So for my money, I'm definitely going for Alan Crabb. He's younger, he has more upside, and he has way better hair.
Brandon, so I got a couple points here. Most important one, can you do me a favor and get on the Blazers Edge Twitter account, which is @BlazersEdge, tweet at the wild one, Mike Rice, and ask him how Pat Connaughton does in practice, because I'd love to know if the garbage time translates over to practice. So, get on that, please.
I'm going to jump on my phone right now and tweet it out. So if you're listening to this has already been tweeted.
Serious answer time. Gerald Henderson versus Alan Crabb. I covered a second ago how this summer Gerald Henderson is $6 million more expensive than Alan Crabb. Kind of the counterpoint is if you assume both of those guys are replacement level players, and what I mean by that is they have a niche role on your team that can be filled by a number of guys around the league, and maybe they're not going to be starters or superstars. In the long run, Gerald Henderson's long-term contract might be cheaper than Alan Crabb's. And so that's a consideration where you could look at it and say, all right, you know what? We're going to have more cap space next year if we sign Gerald Henderson than if we sign Alan Crabb.
Okay, so what about let's move on to another wing player then, who's going to be, I believe he's going to be restricted, has a cap hold of $7 million. Kind of turned it on late in the season when he was able to get a starting role. He kind of shined in that kind of tweener 3-4 kind of stretch role a little bit. Able to do some cross matching with opponents. He was really helpful on the defensive end of the floor in the playoffs. That's Mo Harkless. So this season, were any of you guys surprised at the season that Mo Harkless was able to to really, because the way that it happened, it was kind of, it didn't seem to be that he was really stepping out too much into a very defined role early on, from what I can remember. And then he kind of just, as the season progressed and as the Blazers suffered through, a few injuries, Noah Vonleh's ineffectiveness and then Myers Leonard getting hurt, I think that's when kind of Mo Harkless came in and kind of shined in that kind of tweener stretch role that I talked about. So what do you guys kind of make of Mo Harkless? Did that really catch you guys surprised, his output this season?
Yeah, definitely. And you know who I thought of when I looked at Mo Harkless and his development through the year? They're not at all the same player, but I thought of Thomas Robinson, because Thomas Robinson was a guy who showed you flashes of unbelievable athleticism. He'd have these games or these stretches of games where he would just look unbelievable, and the fans and myself would be salivating and just foaming at the mouth. We want more Thomas Robinson, and he just didn't work out. And I don't know how he's doing now. I think the last I heard he was with the Brooklyn Nets, and then he went to the Sixers, or maybe the Sixers and then the Nets. At any rate, Mo Harkless was much the same way. To start this season, obviously he came from Orlando. He came from a place where Tobias Harris took his starting role. He was pretty discouraged, came to the Blazers, and Mo Harkless had a couple games where he was like really, really good. And people were like, we want more Mo Harkless. And then he'd like drop off, and then he'd do really good, and then he'd drop off.
More Mo.
New York Mo.
# more Mo.
Let's get that trending. I did my part. I tweeted at Mike Rice about Alan Crabb, or about Pat Connaughton. So Eric, now you have to go and tweet about more Mo. So but what I was looking at Mo Harkless, he was kind of doing really well, and then you drop off, doing really well, drop off, and then like the last half of the season, or maybe third plus of the season, he got much more consistent, which is something that you never saw from Thomas Robinson, and gives me a lot of hope for Mo Harkless moving forward. I definitely like how he fits into this Blazers lineup, especially, yes, it's a cliche at this point, and it's only like a year and a half or 2 years old, this new NBA small ball, but Mo Harkless fits into that perfectly. So I definitely like Mo Harkless on this team moving forward for sure.
So one thing that's weird to me about the Mo Harkless situation, we'll call it, is that dude jumps into the starting lineup, looks great on deep, and I'm going to kind of disagree with you a little bit. I'm not going to take out the oven mitts quite yet, Brandon. But I'm going to say that the Harkless-Aminu defensive combination was decent to above average. It wasn't, going to set the world on fire or anything, but they were passable. But the bigger point there is that Noah Vonleh started, 57 games or however many after Myers Leonard went down instead of Mo Harkless. And Terry Stotts had some lame excuse of we looked at the matchup numbers and something about how when Vonleh's in the lineup, certain players shoot better or something. I could never find those. There didn't seem to be any good justification for that. In hindsight, it almost seems like the team was still covertly, I don't want to say tanking, but maybe prioritizing development by playing Noah Vonleh. And then around game 60, they're like, oh, shoot, we better cut that out.
Mo Harkless, what I'm kind of wondering about Mo is, if he is re-signed and you assume that the Blazers, pursue some top level, a free agent or two, a top level and maybe a mid-level kind of guy this summer, or, whether or not they re-sign Leonard, there's kind of a lot of pieces that have to move. But if you assume that the Blazers are going to, improve at certain positions, it makes you wonder if there's going to be, a starting spot for Maurice Harkless next season. And if he's coming off the bench, would he be able to be as effective as he was as a starter?
If he's your starter, I hope he is your fifth starter by wide range, I would say. So I don't expect him to fill one of those roles. I think the thing to think about with him going into next season is how much you're going to pay him, because you're trying to pay a guy based on basically 26 games of production, and that's a very tricky question.
Yeah, I think you're right. The other thing to consider is that, does Mo Harkless feel comfortable on this team? Is Mo Harkless comfortable with the projection of this team in a way that he didn't really feel in Orlando? And now we see, just to bring in some greater NBA news, we know that Scott Skiles, the coach of the Orlando Magic, quit his job after 1 year into a 3-year contract. And some people were reporting that there were murmurs in January that he kind of was thinking about quitting in January and then backed off and said, oh no, temporary insanity. So I wonder if the situation in Orlando is a little bit more precarious and a little bit less less stable than may appear from the outside. And maybe that had something to do with how Mo Harkless is feeling in his production. But if Mo Harkless feels good with his team, I could definitely see him being comfortable with a bench role, because as you said, you don't want him to be a starter unless he's the worst starter on your team. But more what I was saying with those, small ball lineups is that he is a piece you can rotate in situationally when need be. But I could definitely see him as 25 minutes off the bench. That's solid. I think he's definitely good for that for sure.
Word. Shout out to Scott Skiles, NBA Jam Hall of Fame legend. If you wanted to hit 3-pointers, choose the Orlando Magic and play with Scott Skiles, because that guy could freaking grade him.
Was he paired with 3D or Nick Anderson? I can't remember anymore.
Nick Anderson in the NBA Jam Tournament Edition, I'm pretty sure.
What are the chances that Scott Skiles never gets another head coaching job in the NBA again? Because I think it's probably north of 90%.
0%.
Yeah, it's not happening.
No, I think he's sorry. I'm vehemently disagreeing with you.
Oh, you think this guy who quit his job 1 year into a 3-year contract and get another? No team. Why? And plus,
because he saved them a bunch of money. They didn't have to fire him, so he saved them the remainder of that contract. Whereas half the teams in the league are paying two coaches right now, so they love that he left on his own accord. Because there's no way that was a one-way disagreement. How often at work does the boss hate how often at work you hate your boss and your boss loves you? And so the Magic GM right now is yay, we got rid of him without having to pay him, I bet. And so he's going to get our job.
But yeah, I mean, the other thing to think of, you talk about Tobias Harris, they traded that dude away for almost nothing. And it was because Scott Skiles didn't like him. So now they traded away, ostensibly one of the pieces of their rebuild because the coach who's now gone didn't like him. And plus, Scott Skiles is an old school kind of yell at you type of coach, which are kind of you're not really finding them in the NBA anymore. I mean, Byron Scott,
Dan Van Gundy, and Greg Popovich.
Wow.
I don't know if you can say, Greg Popovich is, if he's an old school yelly type of guy, he brings other intangibles that make up for that, or that players accept it. I'm not sure that players are going to accept it from. Look at Nate McMillan. He hasn't worked as a head coach since. He was the head coach of the Blazers 4 years ago, and he had that same.
Missed out there.
And I'm sorry, I have to interrupt and say, breaking news, Eric Griffith is being showered with Blazers Edge hot take oven mitts by comparing Scott Skiles to the likes of Stan Van Gundy and Greg Popovich. Eric, you are this week's oven mitt of the week.
Yes, finally. I've been waiting.
You finally did it.
Episode 136, and I finally got my oven mitts.
That's a heck of a hot take there with Scott Skiles. Getting back,
just to be clear, there was no comparison. The statement was that old school in-your-face coaches don't work in the NBA anymore. I was just pointing out Stan Van Gundy is an old school in-your-face coach, and he works just fine.
Yeah, Stan Van Gundy is an old school in-your-face coach who you kind of think is like a curmudgeonly uncle who's got your back and is going to slip you a $5 bill every now and again. Scott Skiles is that mean, drunk uncle who yells at you and is not fun at all. I mean, totally different personalities. Just because someone's yelling doesn't mean that they're necessarily being mean. I just feel like Scott Skiles is a big meanie. Just a big meanie.
He's got the NBA Jam street cred, so maybe players will like him after all. But, the Portland Trailblazers had a season in 2015, 2016.
They did?
Absolutely. And a huge surprise, I think, I would say, and I don't know what the timeline was for this and when people started, recognizing it and talking about it. And maybe you guys can help me out here because I did not expect this whatsoever coming into the season. I was not particularly impressed with the trade that brought him here per se. Mason Plumlee, I didn't expect him to be as important in the offense, as a guy who was setting up others as he was. And it turns out the dude has insane court vision and an insane ability to find the open man, not only, but also, hit him and put him in a position to score. Coming from the 5 spot, as tall as he is, as athletic as he is, what do you guys think of his skill set? How surprised were you by, Mason Plumlee pulling out his full bag of tricks this year?
I was definitely impressed with the depth of that bag of tricks. The only thing with let's call him Miles Plumlee, who's also an NBA player. The only thing that makes him Plumlee that's a little bit troubling long term is he can't shoot at all. I mean, even Robin Lopez had a tiny, tiny bit of range. I feel like Mason Plumlee has virtually no range. The only thing Mason Plumlee can do is basically get blocked and has like a little push floater. And that's about it.
So I just want to jump in here and say that I think we're still... How old is he? 23, 24? He's a young guy.
He's almost 26.
He's still on the young side. We just discovered that he is apparently one of the best passing centers in the NBA. I hope that's not too hot for non-Portland fans out there. And so I have faith that if the Blazers organization and Mason Plumlee decide that a 10-foot jumper for Mason Plumlee is going to help fix this team, that he's going to come back next season with the 10-foot jumper. He's not the type of player who's like totally broken and unathletic and unable to shoot. So I think that's something that's fixable in the long term.
I would definitely like to see Mason Plumlee with a 10-foot jumper. Would also like to see when he's shooting free throws, the form of his arm and his wrist isn't too bad, but what's going on with his feet? I mean, there are not too many funkier free throw line setups than his. He's got 1 foot, like 3 feet behind the other. You may as well just go full Nick Van Exel and be like 5 feet behind the line. I mean, it's weird. I mean, if you just square up, man, just square up. Come on.
So do you think he's a candidate for the granny shot or no?
I don't think he's quite there yet. In fact, his free throw shooting got way better as the year went on. I think he started the year like 40-something%. I don't have the stats in front of me. Eric, you can probably pull them up at some point, but I think he finished the season around 60%. I mean, near the end, you were definitely not cringing when he was at the line. And if memory serves, he had some clutch free throws at the end of one of those Clippers games during the playoffs. Was it game 3? I want to say that he had some clutch free throws that sealed it. So definitely got better with that. So that's hope. That gives you some hope.
Yeah, the one thing that I will say about Mason Plumlee is that his defensive style is not, he's very athletic and he's quick, but he's not particularly fundamentally sound, we'll say, on the defensive end. And that's an issue when your starting backcourt is Lillard and McCollum. You need a 2009 version of Dwight Howard, or maybe the current version of Hassan Whiteside, with those two guys as your starting backcourt. And so Mason Plumlee, I think, has a spot on this team, either as a power forward, starting power forward, if the Blazers find a center who can shoot, or as a change of pace off the bench center who plays 30 minutes one night when this passing is an asset, and 12 minutes the next night when you're playing the Warriors and they can sniff out the Terry Stotts trickery.
All right, so a couple more guys I want to touch on here before we talk a little bit about more free agency stuff. Izzy Davis and Al-Farouq Aminu. I think to me these were the two. I would say, I don't know if I would say, I don't want to make this too hot of a take, but I was the least surprised by what they brought to the table of all of the unknowns, more or less, that we had, going into the season. We knew that Ed Davis was going to work incredibly hard on the offensive side of the boards. That's something that he did do. We knew that he was going to score mostly on, kind of putbacks and scoring in the lane. Second chance points, creating second chance points for his teammates. That's something that he did. We knew that he was going to be, at the very worst, a competent defender, if not maybe playing a bit bigger than his size at times, being effective a bit on that end. Certain matchups he was particularly effective in, certain matchups he was less effective in. Al-Farouq Aminu, I think the big question mark was his three-point shooting, how that would progress for him this year. I think he turned in a career year of 36.1% in the regular season, which was, I believe, what most fans were kind of hoping for after his stints in New Orleans, Dallas, and Los Angeles. So he brought those up. Defensively, you kind of alluded to this earlier, Brandon, and maybe one of you guys can kind of expand on this a little bit, but Al-Farouq Aminu he's kind of billed as that perimeter defender on the Blazers, kind of that guy that if you need to cross match on a guy and to maybe shut someone down that maybe CJ McCollum and Dame are struggling with. A lot of fans, don't think it's a terrible idea to cross match with Al-Farouq Aminu. He's got long arms. He's able to, switch with multiple positions, he can guard multiple positions, rather. Switching on the perimeter, he can switch with a big guy. He can hold down that stretch four spot, especially if he's hitting that outside shot, which ended up being a bit inconsistent toward the end of the year. Defensively, Al-Farouq Aminu, overrated? Do you want to stand behind that comment, Brandon Goldner?
Yeah, I'll stand behind it. I mean, not like critically overrated. I mean, like you said it. He's long. He can definitely contain like less mobile guards just because he's so long that they can't really get around him, but obviously can't contain super fast guards. And he also can't play against people that are too much bigger than him. I mean, he's pretty slight of build, but the thing you like about him defensively is that he tries defensively on pretty much every possession. You don't necessarily see him falling asleep at the switch, which for a lot of NBA players, I mean, you just want them to be locked in defensively because defense isn't really a lot of fun unless you're a particular kind of player that really relishes those defensive challenges. I mean, so for me, part of it is just saying, yeah, I mean, he has the athletic ability to be a decent defender. But I think saying that he's a great defender, that's probably where the overrated part goes in. But I don't think he's critically overrated or anything like that.
So I think the important point you made there was that he can cross match, but not that well. He's not the Nick Batum where you can stick him on a point guard and say, hey, Nick, go run around this point guard for half the game. Mo Harkless was a lot more capable of doing that. We saw Mo Harkless spend a lot of time on Sean Livingston in the Warriors series. So overall, I think Mo Harkless on the ball is a slightly more versatile defender, we'll say. Al-Farouq Aminu also, when he's off the ball and not engaged in the play, he definitely has a tendency to fall asleep. If the ball is 2 passes away and his man starts to cut, his communication is not perfect. And so there are some criticisms to be made of his game.
And I mean, just to be fair to Al-Farouq Aminu, and I mean, first to be fair to my comment, you're right, I did mean one-on-one defense. But second, to be fair to Al-Farouq Aminu, the poor communication isn't entirely his fault. Again, it goes back to the Blazers haven't played with each other for all that long. I mean, you compare a defense like the Blazers to a defense like, and okay, yeah, the Golden State Warriors, maybe the best team in NBA history. So why are we comparing them to the Blazers? But you watch Golden State play defense, and they look like liquid. I mean, they look like water, right? I mean, they know exactly where to be and when. It's not even all that they're talking to each other. It's just they played with each other long enough to know where to be and when. So I don't know. I feel like it's fair to say that he's not as good of a defender as some people make him out to be, especially people who maybe don't follow the team as well as us three do.
So can we all agree then that maybe Al-Farouq Aminu should stop trying to create as much on the offensive end, maybe not put the ball on the floor as much?
Oh, please. There was no moment where I was more frustrated than when the Blazers absolutely needed a basket and they threw a bailout pass to Aminu. And the point was that he was supposed to kick it to someone else, and he would try to take someone off the dribble. It was like, Al-Farouq, please don't do that. And it's stolen. His dribble is very high. It's pretty sloppy. And he's good enough in the open court, but as soon as he gets some pressure and he's trying to weave through people, it does not work out that well. Not very much fun to watch.
So I'm going to go full oven mitts. I just earned him, so I'm going to use him and say that he's one of the players on the team I would be 100% okay with trading right now. I don't think his defense matches Damian. His weaknesses on defense overlap too much with Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum. And so to be quite honest, I'd rather have Harkless on the court of the current players, and I'd rather see Aminu not on the team and replaced with a guy who can consistently shoot three-pointers, that we know can consistently shoot three-pointers, and we're not having an argument for the entire season about whether or not it's lucky that he's getting hot as the defense packs the paint and Damian Lillard shoots 32% from two-point range.
That is full oven mitts, and I commend you for turning the oven way up on that one, because that can segue into talking about free agency, kind of player movement this summer. Al-Farouq Aminu is one of those guys on the Blazers who, while it's considered a reasonable contract, in terms of the way that it affects the salary cap for the Blazers going forward and how it actually decreases as time goes on, so it becomes an even greater value over time. It's one of the more substantial contracts on the roster, and that means that the Blazers can, potentially bring back more in contracts when they're trading him. So he seems to be one of those pieces that could potentially net back something, of greater value. Whereas Mason Plumlee making $2.5 million, you're going to have to package him, with another player. I see personally Al-Farouq Aminu and Ed Davis kind of having those kind of contracts to where they can beef up a package enough to make it match the amount of contracts that you're planning on bringing in.
Don't you dare talk about trading Ed Davis.
Agreed.
Don't you dare. Ed Davis is, like you said, Chris, Ed Davis is also on an excellent contract. And Ed Davis, as you said, you also said earlier, he didn't really surprise anyone. He just did what he's always done, maybe did it a little bit better this year. But, how can you trade a guy who makes a declaration at the, what do you call it, the postseason interviews, the exit interviews? You know what he said? He said something I've never heard an NBA player say before. He said he's going to put on 15 pounds of muscle during the offseason. I have never ever heard anyone ever say that again. But can you imagine Ed Davis with even 10 more pounds of muscle? Oh, Fizz Ed.
I like Fizz Phys Ed is definitely one of my favorite Blazers to watch. He's certainly one of my favorite Blazers personalities. And when I'm talking about potentially trading guys, you know, it's not a fun thing to think about trading a fan favorite. But if we're talking here, you know, as objectively as possible in terms of what the Blazers are going to have to give to get something in return, it's going to be a player that is useful, proven useful, or has, you know, potential that seems to be untapped. How many guys do the Blazers have in the roster that have the convergence of enough salary to bring back something of value and either enough potential or enough proven value?
I'm going to take it one step further, Chris, and say how many guys on the roster can the Blazers trade at all? And we're talking before July 1. So if we're thinking we want another deal like the Nick Batum one that netted Noah Vonleh and Gerald Henderson for this season, the Blazers are restricted in that they can't trade anyone who's about to become a free agent. That means they can't trade Gerald Henderson, Chris Kaman, Myers Leonard, Maurice Harkless, Brian Roberts, or Alan Crabb before July 1. So those guys are out for draft day deals. So your options at that point are Al-Farouq Aminu, Ed Davis, Damian Lillard, Noah Vonleh, CJ McCollum, and Mason Plumlee. Call me crazy, Lillard, Vonleh, McCollum, and Plumlee aren't going anywhere because Plumlee maybe, but those first three aren't going anywhere because their contracts are so small, or or in Damian's case because he's, you know, the franchise superstar.
Yeah, there's that.
So that really leaves Al-Farouq Aminu and Ed Davis as your two only tradable players if you're interested in getting in on some of that draft day action. And I'd say Al-Farouq Aminu in that scenario is the most likely.
Let me ask you something, Eric. Do you want to get in on some of that draft day action? I mean, if you're Neil Olshey and you're sitting in your little Neil Olshey throne and you're looking at your phone, you got Woj on speed dial, are you looking to get in on that draft, or what's your thought there?
So Neil Olshey's made it very clear that in scenarios like that, he follows the best opportunity available. We'll say he did not intend to end up with Mason Plumlee this summer. He intended to end up with whatever they were going to take with the number 21 draft pick. And so if the Blazers can find a team that's, you know, looking to deal their 27th pick in the draft, and the Portland has a player that they are targeting for it, and that team wants to shed some cap space, I could see Portland, you know, sneaking on in there.
Let's talk about some other hypotheticals here, Eric. Since on Friday you published the free agency primer and it's kind of fresh,
Which, by the way, had no hypotheticals in it.
Let's throw some hypotheticals out here now. So what kind of money can the Blazers clear up if they want to, you know, pursue some top shelf free agents this summer? We're talking the Horfords, the Whitesides. You know, I don't know if they're going to be making a play at a guy like a Chandler Parsons if he decides to opt out. You know, there's a handful of interesting names that we could talk about. So let's throw out some numbers here. What kind of space could the Blazers get available? First off, what guys can we assume that they're probably or they're likely to renounce?
So to start, to answer the beginning of your question, cap space, the salary cap is $92 million. The Blazers are sitting around 85 to 85 and a half, so they have about $7 million in cap space. The player that's guaranteed to be renounced, I would assume, is Chris Kaman, $6.5 million. So that'll bring the Blazers up to $13 million in cap space. To sign any maximum contract free agent, they need at least $21 million in space. So we're looking at renouncing at least $8 million more dollars to get to the point that you can sign a Hassan Whiteside or another lesser tenured NBA player.
Okay, so Gerald Henderson there with that $9 million cap hold, that's a pretty significant amount of money there. Mo Harkless with a $7 million cap hold. That's $16 million in potential cap space right there. You know, AC is down there at under $3 million. I don't see why they would renounce him unless they absolutely had to clear up the space. Brian Roberts, I think, is in there at about $3 million, right?
Yeah, so the most likely, if you're looking at ways to get to the point that you can sign a max free agent, if I had to guess, the most obvious scenario is renounce Chris Kaman and Brian Roberts. That frees up about $10 million, so that brings you up to about $17 million. and then you still need to get up to 21 or 25, depending on who you want to sign. So from there, you can start to renounce either Gerald Henderson, Myers Leonard, or Mo Harkless and make that play at a maximum free agent at that point.
I was just going to ask either you, I mean, we didn't really talk about him yet, but Myers Leonard, I mean, I'm not a fan. Do you renounce him? Did the Blazers renounce him? I mean, it's not only just a matter of, freeing up some money, but also he's going to be super expensive. I don't know.
I think that's kind of a wait for the chips to fall kind of player, see who you can bring into that front court, because what I'm assuming is, and this is kind of what I wanted to talk about, or one of the things I wanted to talk about is, I think it's important that the Blazers bring in some kind of a rim protector for that front court. If you're going to go with that backcourt for the ostensible future with CJ McCollum and Damian Lillard, I think we mentioned this earlier. You're going to have to bring in a guy who can protect the rim, and I think the first guy that you have to consider throwing money at, and we've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast. Personally, to me, is Hassan Whiteside.
So let me drop a piece of breaking news on our Blazers Edge Slack channel. We actually just got across the IM channel, we'll say, word that the Blazers are meeting with Thon Maker, even though they don't have a draft pick. And he is that defensive project center that you guys are talking about, and that is per Yahoo Sports. So just to give Yahoo Sports full credit. And so I think there may be some credibility to the idea that the Blazers are maybe going to look to move into the draft to get that center. So if they don't have confidence in signing Whiteside, I'm wondering if we might see a prospect.
Well, let me ask, I mean, is it really all that uncommon for teams that do not have a draft pick to be meeting with some of these prospects? I mean, to me, it kind of comes down to a due diligence type of deal. So I'm not 100% certain that this is necessarily smoke to a fire. To me, this feels more like a team just kind of doing what it would normally. They have the staff in place to be scouting these players anyway. It just feels like something that you routinely do, even if you don't have a draft pick. Yeah,
it seems like due diligence, and the fact that it kind of came across the wire, the way that it did, to me would imply that maybe it was intended to get out, or it could be a smokescreen. I mean, it could be a number of different things. This, the way that the NBA works now, the way that the Blazers operated on draft night last year, we thought they were going to have the 21st pick, and we ended up with the Blazers ended up with Mason Plumlee after everything was settled. So, I think they're probably just saying, hey, look, if there's an opportunity for us to get up there, we want to take it, and if we do take that opportunity, we want to be ready to be able to capitalize on it. So I imagine we're going to find out that they're meeting with a number of other different players who could potentially be drafted in the lottery. I think, like you mentioned, Brandon, this is kind of just more or less on their end, just business as usual.
Now, if it somehow comes out that the Blazers are meeting with Ben Simmons, then it's time to freak out. Don't anticipate that happening.
I mean,
speaking of freaking out, did you guys catch what LeBron James said the other day?
What did he do?
I believe LeBron, and I may have read this on blazersedge.com, our home site, which you should definitely check out as often as possible. I'm pretty sure, though, LeBron James, arguably the best player in the NBA, sorry, Steph Curry, we'll say third best at the moment, called Coach Stotts the Coach of the Year, and Damian Lillard an All-Star. That's a pretty strong endorsement from a guy who's usually not too quick to go out of his way to compliment other teams.
He also had some nice things to say about CJ McCollum, too. So I guess this begs the question, with LeBron James likely to opt out of his 2-year contract with the Cleveland Cavaliers, is he coming to Portland? Is it time to raise the LeBron banner in Portland?
So let me just say this. The Blazers can clear enough cap space to sign LeBron without trading anyone. So it's a possibility, first of all, if they get the meeting. He is Nike's number one dude at the moment. Nike is nearby. And most importantly, he has some pretty interesting dietary restrictions. He refuses to eat pork for some reason. We're not entirely clear on that. But if you're a guy who has an idiosyncratic food restriction, what city do you want to be living in?
Portland.
Obviously want to come to Portland. I think all signs point to the Blazers are getting LeBron James in the offseason. Book it.
If you're Kevin Durant, do you want to come to Portland too at that point?
Yeah, I mean, and why stop there? I mean, may as well just trade Steph Curry over.
Out of cap space at that point. Sorry.
Hey, Bill Russell's still alive. I think we need a starting rim protecting center. We might as well get him on the action. But let's kind of wrap by talking about, maybe, some potential movement for the Blazers this summer. If they bring, a top shelf front court player that's going to cost a fair amount of money. Let's say it is Whiteside, and then let's say it's Horford. So if it's Whiteside, you need to keep Myers Leonard, right? Because you need that shooting in the front court, or you need to probably move one or two of the other pieces there, because you have Noah Vonleh, Ed Davis, and Mason Plumlee as well. Mason Plumlee, Ed Davis can't shoot. Whiteside doesn't really have any distance to his game either. So Myers Leonard would be a really important guy to bring back in that scenario. So I don't know. You'd have to get rid of Ed Davis or Mason Plumlee to clear room in the rotation and make sure that everybody can get their minutes and make sure that there's an appropriate amount of spacing on the floor, right?
Chris, were you arguing against Hassan Whiteside or for Al Horford? Because I'm a little confused now, because it sounds to me like you're saying the Blazers should go after Al Horford.
Well, if you go after Al Horford, I don't think you get a rim protecting center, though, right?
You definitely don't. But the thing that I'm more disgusted with, and disgusted might be a strong word, is that oftentimes when folks talk about Myers Leonard, and Chris, I'm putting you on blast right now. I'm sorry, buddy. When people talk about
oven mitts,
let me grab my oven mitts. Can I borrow them from you, Eric? I mean, I know that you're the oven mitt of the week. When people talk about Myers Leonard, oftentimes they talk about the idea of Myers Leonard. They talk about the fantasy of Myers Leonard. They talk about the Myers Leonard that could be, that may one day be, that probably never will be, because Myers Leonard is Myers Leonard. And if you had someone at his size with his skill, yes, you're absolutely correct. How amazing would it be to have a rotation that included Hassan Whiteside and a potential maximized Myers Leonard? That would be unbelievable. That'd be great. But the problem with Myers Leonard is that he is who he is. He's had, what is it, his fourth year? It is his fourth year. He's had 4 years to work out whatever kind of consistency issues, confidence issues, and he has never quite put it together. And I mean, I know that he's still young. Some team is going to take a flyer on him, and I only hope that team is not the Portland Trailblazers.
2 words for you: Jermaine O'Neal.
No.
What did he do his first 4 years with the Blazers?
He got 2 minutes a game. It's not the same thing.
I look, Myers Leonard is never going to be an all-star starting center. I think if you can come to terms with that and grade him on a fair curve, if he can be a 20-minute-a-night guy who can come in and play in the front court, protect the rim a little bit, at least serviceably, get a couple rebounds, and hit a few outside shots, at least, even if he's not hitting, he hits it at 40% when he's getting regular playing time. If he does that, that's going to be incredibly important. Even if he's missing his shots consistently, if he's pulling the opposing defense out, if he's warping the opposing defense, I think that's the most important thing about Myers Leonard. I think that's where you get the quote-unquote idea of Myers, because you're not seeing him knock down shots, you're not seeing him take guys off the dribble, you're not seeing him create the way that Mason Plumlee does, but I think it's more subtle to where you're going to see him draw the attention of the defense. And I think having a guy at that size being able to do that, I think it's incredibly important.
Here's the problem with Myers Leonard, and what you described would be true of a different player, say maybe only play him 20 minutes a night because he's inconsistent. Here's the problem with Myers Leonard. His inconsistency gets worse the less confidence the team has in him. He plays better as a starter than he does off the bench. You saw what happened to him this year, and Eric is gesticulating wildly. Myers Leonard wants minutes. He needs that confidence. And Myers Leonard is not a guy that you put in and get 20 excellent minutes from him. He's a guy that you put in for 35 minutes and hope that 15 of them work out okay. That's what he is.
Dude, you just grabbed the brownies with no oven mitts at all. I'm surprised you can still talk. You must be in so much pain. Myers Leonard, every month of the season, improved his three-point shooting. You know what happened as the season went on? He started fewer games. I don't think he at all needs to be a starter. I think he could work out a niche role for himself, and I think this season is pretty solid evidence of that.
Is it worth 10 to 12 million a year to have a 20 minutes per game guy off the bench like that, though, Eric? I think that's kind of the question.
Let me take the oven mitts off or give them back to Brandon because he needs them. And move over to my computer, into my cubicle, and put on my calculator and look at the salary cap and point out that next season the salary cap is raising to $107 million. And so $12 million for Myers Leonard is less than 10 or is barely more than 10% of your cap. And so you could possibly justify having a bench player drawing in, 11% of your total salary.
Is Myers Leonard going to accept $10 to $12 million a year? Last year, he wanted to bet. Exactly. He wanted to bet on himself. He wanted to get a bigger contract. And frankly, I think that Bella is getting quite the taste for expensive dog food. $12 million a year isn't going to cut it.
He has to get offered more than $12 million a year to take it, though.
Someone who says a 7-for-1 center who can shoot 40% from three. He is making more than $12 million a year.
And the thing is that there are teams that maybe don't have the context that me and my infinite brilliance have, that Myers Leonard is not necessarily a super consistent guy. And they're going to look at him and be like, look how old he is. He's super young. Look how big he is. Look at how he can shoot. And they're going to give him a lot of money. I don't know who it's going to be, but someone is going to be throwing money bags at him.
Terrence Ross last year signed an extension for $11 million. No matter what Brandon thinks of Myers Leonard, you cannot deny Myers Leonard is at least 120% of Terrence Ross, which would be $14 million.
You know, the real reason why I'm mad at Myers Leonard, he blocked me on Twitter last year. I'm never going to get over that.
See, now the truth comes out. But you don't need to re-sign Myers Leonard for his floor spacing per se if you do bring in a guy like Al Horford, right? So I think that makes a guy like Myers Leonard a little more expendable. So that was kind of what I was getting at there was Myers Leonard is kind of this piece that it seems to be that Neil O'Shea is going to have to figure out what he decides to do with his front court this summer. Definitely. Myers Leonard is I hope Neil O'Shea hasn't planned, if he hasn't planned in his long-term plans there, to be a complementary player instead of like a long-term starter. And if you bring in another long-term starter, it depends on that guy's skill set. And that's really going to be, what decides what happens with Myers Leonard ultimately, I believe.
Here's the thing to remember, and this was a great point that Brandon actually asked as I was writing my salary cap primer article today, is that Neil O'Shea can make these decisions on the fly depending on which max contract free agents decide to come to, if any, decide to come to Portland. And so if he's negotiating and he gets a commitment from Hassan Whiteside during the moratorium, at that point he can say, you know what, I'm going to keep Myers Leonard because there's that gap period where you don't have to actually officially sign any contracts yet, and so you don't have to actually renounce anyone yet.
Okay, so you brought up Jan Mahimi a little earlier on in the podcast, and I kind of made light of it a little bit, but I think that could potentially be the reality for Portland Trailblazers fans, right? I mean, Hassan Whiteside is going to be getting offers from more teams than just the Blazers, and indeed the Miami Heat are going to be doing all they can likely to retain his services as well. That free agent list of guys who are, unrestricted or restricted and likely to leave their teams seems to be a little thin, and especially if we pare that down to rim protecting guys, who are not entirely past their prime. So what do you think the likelihood is of the Blazers? Do you think if the Blazers strike out on a top tier free agent front court player, do you think they'll sign a stopgap sort of guy or maybe a replacement level guy that's maybe a bit more inclined to protect the rim than Mason Plumlee and Ed Davis and have him start for a few seasons and figure it out later? Or do you think they just go back and allow Mason Plumlee and Ed Davis and whomever else is on the roster to kind of develop into that role going forward?
It's a great question. It's also a tough question because when you think about the role of a GM is to obviously make moves in the short term while still having some frame, some semblance of a plan long term. And there are times when you might have a plan and have different ideas of ways that interchangeable players could fit into your ultimate plan. If it could be one of 3 players that could fit into this slot, which leads to one of 4 players that could fit into this slot. But there are also times in which you get one player and it sort of breaks the entire plan. I mean, there could be a situation in which Neil Olshey targets someone, be it in free agency or maybe with an unbalanced trade or what have you, that kind of takes his plan on a different track. And we don't really know when that's going to happen or how it's going to happen until it does. It's a terribly difficult question, but I mean, the thing that as we're talking about it, the thing that is kind of growing in my mind more and more is the specter of Dwight Howard and seeing that image rehabilitation that he did on TNT and, talking with Charles Barkley and everyone else. And I mean, I honestly came across as a very, very, likable guy, obviously knew what he was talking about, and was saying all the right things. But I have a weird feeling that Dwight Howard's going to make his way into a Portland jersey.
So, Brandon, I think the corollary to the Dwight Howard point is, and the corollary to the other points you were making as well, is that at this point, the Blazers roster is nowhere near complete. And so Olshey is going to have to kind of go for whoever is willing to come here that he can negotiate a decent deal with that is a starting level player. Because we just spent an hour discussing the team, and the consensus was for everyone not named CJ McCollum or Damian Lillard, oh, that guy's great, but he's pretty fundamentally flawed at some level. And so this team has a great bench, has 2 great starting guards, but there are 3 starting, or at least 2 starting front court players away from winning 55 or so games. And so if you can get Dwight Howard, I hate to say this because I came on the podcast and I think I argue pretty strongly against it with you. If you can get someone like Dwight Howard, though, you have to at least think about it if he's your only option.
All right, last question here. Do you guys think that Neil Olshey would be willing to flex a little bit on the, career arc kind of thing with Dame and CJ and some of those younger guys, that core being, somewhere between 25, 26, 27 years old, let's say. Do you think he's going to be flexible on that when he's thinking about who he brings in, now that the Blazers, have seen a little bit of, regular season success, which led into a little bit of playoff success? Do you think that bumps the timeline up a little bit more for the Blazers to that maybe they're, willing to consider signing a guy who's, at the tail end of his prime or maybe 31, 32 years old?
Yes. And I think that part of why Neil Olshey hammered that home last year was because it fit his narrative, right? It fit his narrative to say that all of these players are with Damian Lillard's age and they're going to follow Damian Lillard's career arc. And it went down real nice and easy. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? As a GM, part of your job is to build the best team, and part of your job is to inspire the fans that, hey, we know what we're doing, and we're going to get better, and we have a plan. And honestly, Neil Olshey is an excellent GM in that respect and many other respects. So I definitely think the Blazers are flexible on the career arc. The one area where I do not think they are flexible, and this is why I don't think a player like Hassan Whiteside is going to make his way here, I think the Blazers do value their chemistry very, very highly. I think that they have seen what can be done with Terry Stotts is consistently overachieving with his players. Damian Lillard is an excellent leader, obviously getting the best from his teammates. And so a player more like Al Horford or any number of other players, I think would make a better fit with this team. I don't think they're going to be flexible with that, but with the age thing, yes, I do think there's flexibility there for sure.
I just retweeted everything you said about the age comment.
Wouldn't that kind of eliminate Dwight Howard from the conversation then?
No, and here's my interesting answer. I have flip-flopped. I will admit I am a John Kerry on the win board flip-flopper.
Way to bring back the relevant political reference. 2000, was this the 2004 election we're referencing here?
2004, that classic political commercial.
He's a cyclist. We're in Portland. Let's go with it.
And Hood River has some excellent windsurfing there. So here's what I think. My narrative when I was trying to talk myself into Dwight Howard some months ago, before I became very anti-Dwight Howard, and now I don't know where I stand, but I was talking myself into this narrative of he was in Orlando, he had a lot of success, but he was young, and then he thought he could do better. He was a multiple defensive player of the year, he's an MVP candidate, got to the finals, and he thought he was hot stuff. Goes to the Lakers, he has Kobe Bryant, he has the corpse of Steve Nash, and things didn't work out. So he left, he went to Houston. And then he's paired up with James Harden. I mean, James Harden. So now you have Dwight Howard. He's a little older, right? He's a little wiser. You saw it again on TNT doing the image rehabilitation thing. He knows that people are thinking about it. He's not stupid. He knows people are thinking about it. I do think he's reached a point in his career where he wants to win. I mean, when players get a little older, they want to have a role, they want to fit in, and they want to win. And honestly, the Blazers are a good team. If you want to fit in with a team, the Blazers are not a bad place to land. So, I think that it would have to be conversations with Damian Lillard, conversations with Terry Stotts, Neil Olshey, but I do think that could be a fit.
Dude, are you trying out to be his agent? Because that was pretty compelling. I'm impressed.
I mean, he can send the check to me anytime. Definitely available to take money.
All right, you guys heard it here first. So Dwight Howard, LeBron James, summer of 2016, new Trailblazers. Myers Leonard is going to sign a 7-year contract with the Indiana Pacers, become a 20-point-per-game scorer, get 10 rebounds, and become an all-star. Just like Jermaine O'Neal did back in the day, apparently. Eric, I want to thank you so much for coming on this week, man. We had a lot to talk about. That was quite a mouthful we had earlier.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, Chris. I just want to remind readers real quick, you can find me at Blazers Edge, writing under my name, Eric Griffith. I got a couple articles coming up this week. We have the top 10 moments of the season, and that'll be a video/word article, so you can expect that. And then Chris and I are actually teaming up with Dave Deckard to do a review of Neil Olshey the following Monday, so that'll be in 9 days, and that is a cannot miss article. In the meantime, check me out on Twitter. That's at Deering Tornado. Thanks a lot, guys.
Alrighty, we're all done with the 136th episode of the Blazers Edge podcast. It's pretty crazy, personally, to think that it's been 136 episodes, but we have an entire off season to look forward to. And I want to thank all the listeners for checking out the show this week. I want to thank Blazers Edge staff writer Eric Griffith for coming on the show as well.
Oh, for sure. And as always, we're super thankful to Odar, who produces our intro. You can check out his work at soundcloud.com/OdarBeats. Please tune in for the Blazers Edge, the new Blazers Edge midweek podcast. Chris, let's take a second to say that it now has Dave Deckard and Dan Meringue behind the microphone. Definitely something you want to check out. I mean, I'm sure that you caught their first episode.
Absolutely, man. Dan the Man Meringue, he's been on the Blazers Edge staff doing some analytical pieces. He gets really heavy into the statistical analysis, the video analysis. And as we talked earlier on the podcast, I brought up the Synergy Sports. He brings a lot of that kind of stuff into his articles. And so that transitions really nicely, translates very nicely into a podcast format. So Dan and Dave, you can hear them midweek on the Blazers Edge podcast.
Absolutely. Their chemistry is off the chain. It's a super sick show. You should definitely check it out. But for now, and for Chris, Lucia, I am Brandon Goldner. And remember, if you're not Stackhouse, you are no house.